Hey, sixth grade. We are going to talk through section 4, which is changes in communities. So if you'd open up to page 32, please, and kind of follow along. So this talks about how the land changes throughout different times that happen in different natural disasters and things that happen in the world. So it starts off by talking about some big fires that went through Yellowstone National Park, and that happened in 1988. Now, since then, I think they've had some more fires as well, but I have been there, and what I've noticed is when you're driving in, you see a lot of trees that are really tall, but they are burned from like 3/4 of the way down. And then so at the very top, they may still have some green. And then you see a lot of new growth as well. So you see some really like small trees that have grown after the fires. And so this is what this section is talking about. And so the first vocab word you come across on page 32 is called succession. And it's the series of predictable changes that occur in a community over time. So that can include when a fire goes through, when a flood goes through, when there's volcanoes, hurricanes, or other natural disasters that change the communities. I'm going on to page 33 is primary succession. And this happens when in an area where there's no soil or organisms to start with. So I imagine that when God created the world, this is kind of how it looked before he put grass and all these other things on there. It's just kind of a blank slate is basically what it says. And it says that this may have happened when a volcano eventually formed a new island, like how we think that Hawaii was formed. And so they have a good picture of it at the top. You can see in number 1, it says a volcanic eruption, that there was no soil, only ash and rock. And then for number 2, there was the pioneer species. So that's the next vocab word. And this is the very first species to populate an area. Kind of like we have pioneers when you talk about in history class, like people that got somewhere first, like they were the first ones to discover Michigan or something like that. This is also the same thing. So the pioneer species, these are the first plants that happen in an area. And those are often like mosses or lichens or fungi or algae. All right. And over time, this keeps happening and more species show up, and it creates soil because those plants break down, and that's how soil is created. Sorry for all the noises in the background. And then eventually you get fertile soil and maturing plants. And so the last picture number 4 on page 33, is showing something that you'd be more used to now. When you look outside, this is what we're at. Number 4, primary succession is over. And now plants can grow like they should be able to. So I'm going to turn to page 34. And what we have is called secondary succession. And this would be the fire at Yellowstone. So there were already plants there, but then the fire came through and it burned them all up. And so it had to restart over. Okay, it doesn't, like I said, when I went there, the only evidence that there was a fire was that some of the trees that were not completely burned, they just didn't have anything growing on their bottom half. And their bark maybe looks white, like it had been burned and maybe turned to ash. But other than that, I wouldn't have known because the grass grew back. And, and if you've ever had to weed your garden, you know that weeds show up much quicker than plants do. And you're like, how did they even get here in the first place? Okay, so in secondary succession, it's where the ecosystem has been disturbed, so by a fire or a flood or something, but where soil and organisms still exist. Okay, and they can come back to life. So I really like the pictures at the top of the page. You start with like an abandoned field. Grasses and wildflowers have taken over this abandoned field. And then trees will eventually grow because what do birds do? They drop seeds everywhere, and trees will just grow out of, being planted by a bird or by other animals. And then you can get a forest, and then you have a mature community. So I think it's very possible, that God created the world with all of these things already in place. However, think about the flood. Noah's, the flood that's associated with Noah would have taken everything out. And I don't think possibly would have had an abandoned field, but it may have even looked more like the primary succession, where it had to start all over again. And again, you would have no clue, like living in Michigan especially, there's forests everywhere, especially if you go up north. You would have no clue that however many years ago there was a flood that took everything out. Okay, so this is the succession, and it's just like a process of how things evolve, in the sense of if something is destroyed, new life can come out of it. And I think that's just a really good analogy for what God can do, right? Especially during these times like this, there's some crazy stuff going on in our world, and people feel defeated and things like that. But God can bring those things back to life, and He can breathe life into them. And those that maybe were on the fence about Jesus can come back and say, well, maybe I'm going to give it a shot. What else have I got to lose? So I think that that's why I really like going into ecology, just because we get to talk more about God and, Him creating and the things that He's done. And, succession, is a process that He created. He didn't want, after a fire, came through, or after a flood came through, He didn't want it to be just desolate and to look like a desert and just a place you don't want to be. He allowed new life to grow, and I think that's really awesome. So I hope that you understand that section a little bit more, and I will talk with you soon. Bye.